In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural green camo fabric material. And after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join it together into this custom node group. So we have the overall scale here, so you can change the size of the entire material on your object. And then we have 4 different colors for the camo. So if you want to make it more like a brown camo, you could do that. Or you could make it kind of like a light brown for like a desert camo, or more of like a green color. So there's 4 different colors to change the colors of the material. Then we also have the fabric weave scale. So if I zoom in really close to the material, you can see there is some bump there of the fabric weaves, so you can change the scale there. Then we also have the fabric noise scale, which is just a little bit of noise over the surface to make it look kind of fuzzy. And then we have the fabric noise scale. So if you kind of look here on this object, there is actually a little bit of fabric noise just to make the fabric look like it's a little bit bumpy and a little bit folded. Then we also have the sheen value here, and this will help to make it look more like fabric. So you can kind of see the shading there on the edges. It just looks a little bit brighter when the sheen is turned up. And then there's also the sheen tint, and I have this set to kind of like a grayish greenish color. And then we have the bump strength, so we have the weave bump strength, and then we just also have the noise bump strength, and then we also have the folds bump strength. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support the channel, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. The links are in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you can also purchase my procedural material packs, which are just packs of 10 procedural materials. And you can get any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist. The links are all in the description. So I'll now show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I wanted to preview this material on a sphere, so I went to the add menu and I added an icosphere, and right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I turned the subdivisions up to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round, and I'll use the object context menu and shade it smooth. Then I'm going to scale this object down by 0.2 so it's a better size when modeling to the real life scale in Blender, and I'll press Ctrl A and just apply the scale so that's the object's new default size, and just move this over. Now I'm also going to go to the add menu. I'm going to add a UV sphere, and I'll scale the sphere down and move it over here. I'll actually move it a little bit farther away, and I'm going to be creating a simple cloth physics so that we actually can preview this on a cloth object. Let's also shade this object smooth. I'm also going to go to the add menu, and we're going to add a plane, and let's move the plane above the sphere and we'll scale it down a little bit, something like that, and then apply the scale. We'll go into edit mode, and I'm going to use the object context menu and click on subdivide. You can also press Ctrl E, and then you can click on subdivide. Now after you subdivide it, you can click on the subdivide settings right behind me, and you can turn up the number of cuts, and I'm just going to make it pretty detailed, maybe something like that. Let's also subdivide it one more time so it's even more detailed. So now I can go back to object mode, and I want to actually add the cloth physics to this object. So over here on the side panel, we're going to go to the physics properties, and we're going to add cloth. And then on the cloth, let's scroll down here, and we want to open up the collisions, and we want to check mark the self collision so it actually collides with itself. Now I've been doing this in the shading workspace, but if you go here to the layout, you should have a timeline right here. So I'm going to drag the playhead on the timeline back to the starting, and I can press the spacebar to play this, and we'll just let this simulate. Now this might be happening for you where the cloth simulation is kind of scrunching up, and that is because of the distance of the vertices. So what I can actually do, a really easy way to fix this, is just to scale both of these objects up much bigger, and now if I play the simulation, you can see that it's not bunching up like that. So let's select this object here, and on the physics, we're going to add the collision. So now when I press the spacebar to play this, you can see the cloth will actually collide with it. And then I can kind of scale this object up, maybe move it down, bring it forward a little bit, and you can just play around with this until you get a simulation that you like. I think I want it to be a little bit bigger. All right, so something like that is pretty good. So I'll just use the object context menu and shade it smooth. And then to apply this, we need to click here on the modifiers. And on the modifiers, we want to click on the drop down and apply the cloth modifier. Now to make this look more realistic, I can press Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels. And then let's scale both of these objects down, and I'm going to just bring this object over here and just stick it next to the other sphere. And then also if you select the cloth object, you can click on add modifier, and you can add the solidity solidify modifier, and let's drag these little dots here and drag it up above the subsurf so that it first adds the solidify and then adds the subdivision. And I'm going to drag this thickness value way down just to make it very thin, and that's basically all I did to create the cloth. And if you're interested in learning more about cloth physics in Blender, then definitely check out my cloth physics for beginners tutorial with the link in the video description. Then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects, and if you select the camera and go to the object data properties of the camera, I turn the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom it in because I like how that looks a bit better. And then I added some lights to the scene, so I'll just go into the rendered viewport mode so I can see this in the rendered view. So I added these two lights here, so these are both area lights. If you go to the add menu, you can go to light and add an area light. And this first one here I set to 50, and I just made it pretty large, shining down on the objects. And then this one here is set to 30, and I have it kind of as a backlight. So both of the objects are kind of coming from the back of the objects. Now to get some more realistic lighting and reflections, I also went here to the world properties, and I added in the Machine Shop 02 1K HDRI from polyhaven.com, and I'll have the link in the video description if you'd like to download the same HDRI. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version on Polyhaven. So when you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot next to color, you can choose environment texture, and then click on the open button and just add in the HDRI that you downloaded. And then I also set the strength to 0.8 so it was a little bit less bright. Now just a few more settings that I'm going to go over. So if you go over here to the render properties, I am going to be using the Cycles rendering engine. And now here on the film tab, I'm going to checkmark the transparent button. So the background is transparent, but it will still light the scene. And then also, if you go down here to the bottom and open up the color management, I set the view transform to filmic and the look to very high contrast to pop out the colors and make everything more contrasted and saturated. So I am going to go over here to the shading workspace. So in the shading workspace, I have the 3D viewport on this side, and I will go up into the rendered viewport mode. And then I have the shader editor right here so we can work with the nodes. So I'm going to select one of the objects. Let's click on new to add a new material, and I can drag and drop the same material onto this object here so they both have the same material. And then I can rename this to green camo fabric. And then I'll also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit, you can go to the Preferences, and on the Add-ons tab, you can go to the Search and search for Node Wrangler. Just enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and it's built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So let's close the user preferences. So we're going to start off by creating 3 different patterns. So I'll go to the add menu, let's add a noise texture and drop it here. And I can hold down the Control and Shift key and select different nodes. And that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to preview the nodes on the object. Let's also press Ctrl T with the noise texture selected to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And usually I like to use the object, and I like to put the object into the vector because it places the procedural textures on the object more evenly. However, I'm going to use the UVs in this case, and I'm using the UVs because this is going to be put on cloth objects because it is a fabric material. And so when you're using cloth objects, you want the procedural material to actually move along with the folds of the object. So it would be really weird if the material was super random and just changed at random points when the cloth is moving around. But with the real cloth in the real world, the pattern moves along with the folds of the cloth. And also the fabric weaves move along as well. So that's why I'm going to be using the UVs instead. Now, if your objects haven't been UV unwrapped, then there's going to be some issues. For example, you can see the default UV unwrap has some cuts here. And so you are going to see a few seams here in the texture. However, this object here was from a plane, and the plane was already UV unwrapped. So there aren't any issues. If I just turn the scale up so you can kind of see that better, there aren't any issues, and you can see how the noise is actually moving along with the folds of the fabric. So that's why I'm going to be using the UV instead. So let's now change some of the settings of the noise. So on the type here, I'm going to change this to the hetero terrain, and on the scale, I'm going to turn this to 70. Then on the roughness, I'm going to turn this to 0, and I'll just leave that how it is. But then I'm going to go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, and we're going to drop this in between the mapping and the noise. So this way, because this noise texture is going through the vector, it's distorting the placement of this noise. And I can see it looks very distorted. But let's change some of the settings. So for this noise, I'm going to turn the scale to a 1.7. Let's also turn the detail to the max of 15, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now I want to to make it more contrasty, so let's drag these nodes back, and I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp here after this noise. Now on the linear here, I'm going to change it to constant instead, and then I can drag this white tab over to make it more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the white tab over to about there, so now you can see there's some little white areas and black areas. So that's starting to look like the camouflage texture. Now this procedural material will get a little bit complex, so I want to keep my nodes nicely organized by adding frames. So I'm going to box select these nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to join them into a frame, and then you can drag the frame around, and if you select the frame and press F2 to add a label, I'm going to call this mapping. Now I'm going to click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame. You can select the frame and press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to pattern 1. Now I want to make 3 different patterns, so I'm going to select all these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl Shift D. Ctrl Shift D will duplicate the nodes, but keep these wires plugged up. Let's Control Shift and select this color ramp, and I can change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to a 45 of the first noise texture, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now on the second one here, I'm going to turn this detail value way down to like a 7, and then I'll leave those settings how they are. Now here on the color ramp, I want to drag this white tab out kind of to about here, and then I want to hold down the control key and click here to add another tab, and I'm going to drag this one kind of over to about here, so I can kind of see how that texture is looking. So let's select this frame here and press F2 to add a label, and let's rename it to pattern 2. And then I'll box select these nodes. I'll press Ctrl Shift D to duplicate them again. Let's Control Shift and select this one here, and I can select the pattern 2, press F2 to change the label, and we'll change it to pattern 3. And then for this one, I'm going to turn this first noise scale to a 90. And then I'll leave the other settings how they are. But then on this back one here, I'm going to turn the scale to a 1.2. I'll turn the detail to the max of 15. And then the roughness, I'm going to turn this to a 0.45. Now here on this color ramp, I want to select the black tab. I'll hit the minus to get rid of it, and then I'll just kind of drag this around and get it to something that I like. So something like that is looking better. So if I Control Shift and select them, you can see we have 3 different groups of textures, and I now want to join them together and add the custom colors. So I'm going to drag these nodes back. I'll close that side panel, and I want to go to the add menu, and to mix colors together, we can add the mix color node. So we'll drop this down here. So I want to have 3 different mix nodes. So the first one is going to add the custom colors for the first one, and then we'll use the other 2 mix nodes to mix these patterns together. So what I'm going to do is take pattern 1, we'll put the color from the color ramp into the factor, and I'll Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. And then let's make the custom colors. So for color A, this is going to be kind of like a grayish light green. And for color B, this will be a little bit of a darker green. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, you can use the same hex values. So color A will be a hex value of 4C6741. And then color B is going to be a hex value of 3B562F. So let's duplicate the mix, and we're going to drop it right here, and we can now use this to mix in the next one. So this pattern 2 here, this is going to go into the factor, and then this mix here is going to go into color A. So now color B can be the color of the next texture. So for color B, let's make this like a really dark green. And the hex value for this dark green here in color B is going to be a hex value of 1A2F17. So we'll duplicate the mix one more time and drop it here. And again, this mix here, this is going to go into color A. And then this pattern 3, that is going to go into the factor. And the factor is determining what parts will be color A and what parts will be color B on the object. Now for this one, it's going to be a bit lighter and kind of a grayish color. So kind of like a grayish green. And the hex value for color B is going to be 2A, 3C, 1F. So that is going to be the base color. So what I can do is drop the principled shader right here, maybe bring this up. Let's bring these farther back. So now we have all these mixes, and let's drag the mix colors up together, just kind of compact them so it looks a bit more nice and organized. And let's box select these 3 nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to add a frame. We'll hit F2 to add a label, and I can just rename these to like base color. And make sure the mix result is going into the base color of the principled shader. Now you can see that this fabric is looking a little bit too shiny. It doesn't really look realistic. So on this roughness here, I'm going to turn this up to like a 0.8 so it looks quite a bit more rough. So I'm now going to be creating the fabric weave texture. So to do this, we'll go to the add menu and let's search for a wave texture. We'll drop this down here, and I want to use the same mapping because we want to use the UVs. So the vector is going to go into the vector of the wave texture. I can also hold down the shift key and right click and drag over the wire to add this reroute, and I'll drag the reroute down here, and then I'll shift and right click and drag to add another reroute and drag this over here, just because I like to keep the nodes super organized. Let's Control Shift and select the wave texture, and I'll zoom in here so we can preview it, and let's change some of the settings. So for this one, I'm going to change the scale to like a 350, and then also this distortion here, I'm just going to turn up to a very small number like a 5. So if I zoom way in, you can kind of see what the distortion is doing, so it's just making it look a tiny little bit more random. And then let's turn the detail level all the way to the max of 15, but then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now I'm going to select this wave texture and I'll press Ctrl Shift D to duplicate the node but keep the wire plugged up. Let's Ctrl Shift and select this one to preview it. And I'm going to keep all the settings the same except that I'm going to take the X and I'm going to turn this to Y instead. So this way it'll be going in the opposite direction. So I now want to mix these together to create the fabric weave texture. First though, I want to make them a little bit more contrasty, so I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp after the wave, and then I can drag this black tab over to make it more contrasty, and I'll bring it to about there. Then I'll press Shift D to duplicate. We'll drop it down here, and the other wave texture color can go into the factor, so now it looks more contrasty. Now to mix them together with a mix color, you can box select the two color ramps, and you can press Ctrl 0. Ctrl 0 is the shortcut key for adding the mix color node, and you can see it's already plugging them both up. And then I'm just going to leave the type set to mix, and I'll leave the factor to 0.5. And this way you can see we're getting kind of this checker of these little white lines with the black squares. And so that is looking like fabric weave. So let's box select all these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J to add them into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'll rename this to fabric weave. So let's Control Shift and select the principled shader, and I now want to put some values into the normal to give it some bump. So we're going to take this mixed result here from the fabric weave, we're going to put that into the normal, but there's some weird shading issues, and that's because we need to convert the color data into normal data that the shader can use. So I'll go to the add menu, let's add a bump node. We'll put the bump node here between the mix and the principled shader, and we want the mixed result to be going into the height value. So now you can see the fabric looks really bumpy, but that is way too strong. So I'm going to turn the bump strength down to like a 0.25, so it's much more subtle. So let's duplicate this bump node and drop it here after the first one, and we're going to duplicate this one more time and drop it here. So now we have 3 of them. Now these other 2 I'm going to use to make it a bit more fuzzy and then also to add some folds. So to create those textures, we'll go to the add menu, we're going to add a noise texture. Let's drop it here, and we're also going to duplicate it and put another one. So we have 2 different noise textures. Let's Control Shift and select this noise texture to preview it, and I want to use the same mapping, so I can actually go here to this reroute, and I can click and drag, and then let go here, and then I can search for reroute, and just add a reroute there. Then I can click, drag over, let go, and again I can add another reroute, and then click and drag and stick this up to the vector. And let's do that for the same noise texture here, so I can take this reroute and put that into the vector of this noise texture. So now let's change some of the noise settings. So for this one, I'm going to turn the scale to 40 so it can add a lot of fuzz. Actually not a 40, I want to change it to 400. So now it's much more detailed. Let's turn the detail to 15, and this roughness here I'll turn to like a 0.55. So now we have a pretty detailed texture. So now this noise texture factor can go into the height value of this bump, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now if I turn this strength up here, you can see it's going to be stronger, so you can see now it looks much more like a fuzzy fabric. Although that is way too strong, it looks really rough. So let's turn this strength way down to just like a 0.1. So it's going to be much more subtle, but that'll definitely make it look a bit more noisy and bumpy on the surface. And then I also want to use this noise texture to here to add some folds. So I actually want to preview this on this sphere because you'll kind of be able to see that better. So let's Control Shift and select this noise texture to preview it. And to change the settings, we're going to turn the scale to a 10, and I'll just leave the detail at 2 so that it doesn't have that much detail and it looks kind of like folds. And then this distortion here, I'm going to turn the distortion to a 0.4, so it's just a little bit distorted and it kind of moves around in circular motions. So we can put the factor into the height value of this bump, Let's Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. And if I turn up the strength, you can see what it's doing. So it looks like there's some little folds in the fabric. But I'm going to turn the strength way down to like a 0.2, so it is much less strong. So we can box select these nodes here. I can press Ctrl J to join them into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this bump. Now I also want to add the sheen to make it look more like fabric. So let's open up the sheen here on the principled, and I'm going to turn the weight all the way up to 1, and I'll leave the roughness at 0.5, but you can change this if you want to. And then for the tint, I'm going to make this kind of like a light green. And the tint hex value that I'm going to be using for this color will be 617F49. So that is it for the procedural material. So I'm now going to show you how to join this together into a custom node group. So let's click and drag and box select all the nodes except the material output. You can press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. Now if you press the tab key, that's going to go in and out of the node group. So I'll go out of the node group and I'll drag the node group over here, and let's zoom in here, and I'm going to click and drag to make it bigger, and then I can copy the green camo fabric. I'll press Ctrl C to copy that, and then Ctrl V to paste that. So now it's called green camo fabric. So let's hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll press the N key to open up this side panel. And if you click here on the group tab, you can change the interface here. So I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to shader because I like that better. So if you go outside of the node group, you can see that socket there is just called shader. So let's go back into the node group. Now if you go right over here to this side, we have the group input, and we can plug values up to the group input to control those values outside of the node group. So this mapping node is being plugged up to all the textures, so this scale value will change the size of the entire material. So we'll put the scale into the socket here, and then if I click on the scale, it's going to be 3 values, but I instead just want it to be 1 value. So let's change the type here to float instead, so it's 1 value, and then I'll turn the default value to 1, and then if I go outside of the node group, we need to turn the scale back to 1, so it's using a scale of 1. So let's go back into the node group. So I now want to add all the custom colors, so I'm going to drag the group input right up here above these base colors, and I'll put color A into the extra socket, also color B, and then also color B of the next mix, and then finally this one here. So we'll put that into the extra socket. And then you can click right here to rename them, and I'm going to rename these colors 1 through 4. So I now want to control the fabric weave scale, so we're going to drag the group input down here behind the fabric weave, and we're going to put this scale right here into the extra socket, and then we can take the same wave texture and we can put this scale into the same socket. So this way this single scale value will control both of the waves. So if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename this to fabric weave scale. Now I'm going to drag the group input right over here underneath the bumps, and I want to take the first noise and we'll put that into the extra socket, and I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to fabric noise scale. And then let's also do the same thing for this one. So we'll take this other noise scale and put that into the extra socket. But this one, instead of fabric noise scale, it's going to be called fabric fold scale. Then I want to control the roughness of the material. So we'll drag this up here next to the principled shader. And let's take the roughness value and we'll put that into the extra socket. And then I also want to add the sheen, so we'll add this sheen weight here, put that into the extra socket. And then also if you want to, you could put the sheen roughness into the extra socket there, but I'm just going to not do that and use the tint instead. So we'll put the tint into the extra socket, and you can see it's called a sheen tint. And then I want to control the bump strengths, so we'll drag this behind the bump. And you can see this first one here is controlling the weaves, so we'll put the strength into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to weave bump strength. Then the second one is just the noise, so we'll put this into the extra socket, and I'll double click on this and rename it to noise bump strength. And then the final one here, that is going to be the folds. We'll put the strength into the extra socket, double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to folds bump strength. Alright, I'll select the group input and I'll drag it back here to the very end. I'll press the N key to close the side panel. I'll hit the tab key to go outside of the node group, and there is the finished procedural material. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material, and remember this is being controlled by the UVs, so if you don't like how the texture is placed on the object, you could use the object coordinates instead, or you could just UV unwrap your object. Then we have all the different colors, so we have colors 1 through 4, so you can really change these if you want to make more like a brown camo or a desert camo or whatever you want to do. Then we have the fabric weave scale, we have the fabric noise scale, and the fabric fold scale. Then we have the roughness of the material, but it looks a little bit weird if it's really shiny, so I usually leave the roughness value higher because it's fabric. And then we also have the sheen weight. This kind of helps to make it look more like fabric. And then we also have that sheen tint. And then we have the bump strength, so the weave bump strength, and the noise bump strength, and the folds bump strength. So that's it for this tutorial, so I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thank you for watching. And you can purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, so if you're interested, I'll have the links in the video description. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, and my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're all pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And every time I create 10 more procedural materials, I update the material pack with the new materials. So if you purchase the procedural material pack, then you'll get future updates with more materials. You can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist. The links are all in the description. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.